Hi guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I wanted to talk today about the placebo effect and how it impacts in nutrition and nutritional studies. The placebo effect is a scientifically recorded phenomenon whereby there is an ability for people to affect their health, their physiology, their biochemistry simply through the power of belief. Many people consider the placebo effect to be pseudoscience, or they think that it's to do with some kind of mystical powers. But really, the placebo effect is a scientifically recorded phenomenon. Nobody knows how it works or what it really is, but it is in science. And the fact that nearly all well-designed studies, particularly clinical trials, include a placebo would suggest that scientists have accepted the placebo effect is a real phenomenon. So that's just to clear that up. The placebo effect is not something that is debatable. The placebo effect is measurable, it is recorded, and the placebos are included in nearly all human clinical trials. Now, if you've ever seen a trial that said that it's single-blinded or double-blinded, the reason that's done is because the placebo effect is to do with belief. It's very important that the people who are taking either the drug or nutrient or the placebo don't know whether they're getting the nutrient or the placebo, because if you know you're getting an active drug, if you know you're getting a particular treatment, you can actually affect the outcome of the trial. So the placebo effect is the reason behind the placebo effect is not understood, but the placebo effect itself is taken into consideration very carefully during scientific design. So it's very important to understand that. Now, how does this relate to nutrition and how does this relate to health? Many people dismiss the placebo effect. For example, if you take a pill, let's say you take a supplement and you say, this supplement did X, Y, and Z to my health. Without scientific data to back up those effects, a scientist would turn around and say, well, a doctor, a scientist, somebody involved in healthcare, let's say, let's widen the net, somebody involved in healthcare could turn around and say, well, that's just a placebo effect. Now, that may very well be true, but if you get a 10% improvement in your health from taking something, and it is the placebo effect, that's still a 10% improvement in your health. And I think the placebo effect really is maligned and it's vilified by the medical establishment to a large extent. They always look at the active drug. They say, well, active drugs are the way to go. But in many clinical trials, the active drug is no better than a placebo. Not because the active drug didn't have an effect, it's just because the placebo had so much of an effect, there was no statistical difference between the two. So the placebo effect is not a small effect. Often in studies it is often quite considerable, and one area in medical research where this is actually very problematic is in the study of antidepressants. Now, the drugs we have to treat depression are not that effective anyway, and this is partly due to the fact that I don't think science really understands what depression is. They look at it from a materialistic point of view, and obviously there are aspects of the brain that you could argue are non-materialistic, and depression may be in that grey area between materialism and non-materialism, and therefore it's very difficult to understand exactly what depression is. Trying to treat something that is non-materialistic with a materialistic medicine may not be fully effective, and this may be why our antidepressant drugs don't always work. That being said, many of the trials where they test antidepressants, they use a placebo in order to be able to judge the usefulness of the drug. Now, I came across a paper the other day that was very interesting, and it was a paper where they took depressed men who were being non-medicated, and they gave them one of two treatments. They either gave them fluoxetine 20 milligrams per day, which is a typical antidepressant treatment. It's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or they gave them a placebo. Now, these men had access to a clinical setting where there was a certain environment of treating depression, and therefore all of the men were exposed to obviously the researchers as well, and the interest in their depression, as well as various groups and activities that would be conducive to perhaps helping people with depression. They weren't given any psychotherapy, they weren't specifically targeted, and their depression wasn't investigated, but they were in an environment where you may have expected them to improve. And surprisingly, all of them did, as a group, they improved and their depression got better. But that wasn't the interesting thing about the study. You would expect, and many antidepressant studies have shown that when you give people either the active drug or the placebo, there is usually an improvement in both groups. Sometimes the active drug shows a statistically better effect than the antidepressant, than the placebo. Sometimes it doesn't. In this case, what they did is to measure the antidepressant effect of the treatment. They took a scan of the brain and they measured the glucose metabolism in various parts of the brain. And there's a vague understanding of how the glucose metabolism is affected in different parts of the brain when depression is there, and how that glucose metabolism shifts when the depression is treated. One of the areas they look at, for example, is the limbic system, and there can be a certain change in glucose metabolism there when depression occurs. And if that glucose metabolism changes over time, you can usually predict whether the depression is getting better or worse. It's not an exact science, but they know roughly what they're doing with this. Now, when they looked at the areas in the brain that were affected by the treatment with fluoxetine, they saw changes that they would expect to see when depression was lifting. Of particular areas of the brain, the glucose metabolism either gets more or less. It varies in different parts of the brain, and this was consistent with a lifting of the depression, which is what you would expect. But when they looked at the placebo scans, they found that the placebo was affecting the glucose metabolism in exactly the same parts of the brain as the fluoxetine. Now, the effect wasn't so great, and there were slight differences, but generally the patterns were statistically the same. In other words, the placebo was able to affect the brain areas, the exact same brain areas as the fluoxetine through this scanning process, which would suggest that the placebo will not as effective as the fluoxetine affecting these areas. It certainly seemed to have a similar effect. Now, this is I'll put the link to this study so you can have a look at it, at your leisure, and you can read through it. It's a very interesting paper, and there are many studies that have been done like this. And looking at antidepressants is a very good way of studying placebo effects. And I just wanted to show this this paper for a number of reasons. Firstly, I believe, which is what placebo means, the placebo effect is a real phenomenon, and it's actually very useful. If you get an effect from taking a supplement, and that effect is something that's beneficial to you, it's absolutely irrelevant that has come from a placebo effect. A 10% improvement in something that you want to see an improvement in is better than nothing. The second thing to say about the placebo is often the effects in the placebo are just as great as taking an active drug or an active substance. Now, it's very difficult to comment in great depth about the placebo effect because we don't really understand what it is or how it works. So there's many good books out there, and I would suggest, if you're interested in this kind of topic, that you perhaps actually don't look at the scientific literature. There are many people that have reviewed this in a non-academic way, but using scientific literature as evidence, and there are some very good popular books on this that give you a good understanding. And once you've read those, you can then go to the scientific literature and look at the studies that have been done on the actual placebo and the placebo effect, and trying to measure it and trying to quantify it. And of course, the scientists can't quantify it because they don't really know what it is. It's affecting what appears to be a non-materialistic part of the brain, something we can't measure, something to do with consciousness or something to do with our thought processes. And the brain is very misunderstood by scientists anyway. We haven't really even scratched the surface of how it works. And so scientists generally don't really understand what the placebo effect is. They can measure the effects of it, and they can see its effect in clinical trials. but they can't actually get a theory as to what might really be going on. There have been suggestions, but I don't think any of those suggestions really stand up to proper scrutiny, and that's mainly because they're coming at it from a materialistic point of view. So if you have a look at this paper, do some reading on in the popular press, and that will allow you then to go to the scientific literature and look at some of these studies, particularly the ones that have been done trying to investigate what the placebo is. Now, in nutrition, it's very common when you have clinical trials to have a placebo, and just as with nutrition, just as with drugs, in nutrition, there is a placebo effect. It's observable, it's recordable, and often this placebo effect in nutrition is quite great. So what I'm really getting at here is that, if I've always said this, if it works for you, it works, and that's really all you need to know. Just because there isn't a scientific paper supporting or backing up or showing a mechanism as to why something should work doesn't mean that it doesn't have an effect. An absence of proof is not proof of absence. That's quite true. And we have to remember that very often the scientific literature follows the anecdotal evidence. And this can be seen in the writing of introductions. In nutrition literature, this is very common. There will be an introduction that will explain that there is a particular herb in, for example, Chinese medicine or Indian medicine that is purported by the local populations to be able to do X, Y, and Z. This will usually cite historical precedents and historical evidence of anecdotal evidence that this has been used for many, many years, and therefore, this is worthy of scientific investigation to see if there's an effect. So all those people, and many times these studies support what the historical context shows. In other words, these people have been using these nutrients or these drugs or these herbs for many, many, many centuries, and science then says, well, hey, maybe we should investigate this. It doesn't suddenly become a useful nutrient simply because there is a scientific paper written on it. It was useful for centuries before any science investigated it. So this is often dismissed if people turn around and say, well, there's no paper that shows this, there's no paper that shows that. That doesn't mean that there is not an effect. It just means nobody has written a paper on it. And I think this is something that's really important. It's very misunderstood, and it's misunderstood by scientists. You can look at the historical use of many herbs that have been used in Chinese medicine for thousands of years, not just hundreds of years, thousands of years, and there is very little actual scientific research done on them, but that scientific research, when it is performed, actually corroborates what the Chinese medicine has been showing for centuries. Acupuncture is a very good example of that. The Chinese have known for many, many, many centuries that acupuncture is useful. They know exactly what effects it has. They have their own theories on how it works, and Western medicine for a long time dismissed it as quackery, and then papers started to be published on it and investigate it, and yes, it does actually have the effects that the Chinese medicine has been saying for centuries. So it's very important not to dismiss things just because science has not investigated it, and it's very interesting that there are many doctors and many scientists that believe that if there isn't a scientific paper written on something, then there can't be a positive effect, and that's not really science. It's not scientific. So don't dismiss the placebo effect. It is a very powerful effect, and there are many very interesting studies that have been done on it. If you get an effect from a nutrient, if you take a nutrient and it has a positive effect and you're happy with it, that's good. Don't feel that you have to stop taking it because somebody turns around to you and say, well, this paper proves it doesn't work. It's still working for you. It might work for some people and not in other people. The study that, for example, that investigated the nutrient may not have been well designed. There are many studies that use very small sample populations. They use bias in their selection of their populations, and as a result they don't get positive results for nutrients, and this is actually quite common. So the science isn't always the arbiter of the truth. Science is just a process that people go through in order to be able to observe things, to be able to measure things, and try and put a particular order into the world that we see around us. And that process is not always very streamlined. Sometimes it can be very erratic, and sometimes science does go in the wrong direction. And that is a reflection of the fact that it's humans that are performing the science, and humans are fallible. So like I say, I will put the link to that video in the comments box below, and if you know of any other papers, if you know of any good books, if you know of any good material or anything on the internet that is interesting and related to the placebo effect and you want other people to see it, please put that in the comments box below as well. Any comments that you make, I will try to get back to you as soon as possible, as always, and I will see you next week for another video, and in the meantime, take care.